$200, or 30 days in a cage for a taillight. The court is not a charity, and this town doesn't owe people like you anything. Now get out of my sight before I have the bailiff drag you down to the cells.
Judge Harlan Boone didn't even look up from his bench. His face was contorted with the bored, a comfortable cruelty of a man who had ruled this county like a god for 19 years. He had just ordered a 71-year-old black woman, in her pressed Sunday dress, to be cuffed and locked away over an unpaid traffic ticket. In the back row, a broad-shouldered black man in a dark funeral suit stood up slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He just held a cheap pen and a funeral pamphlet. His knuckles white, Boone's gavel came down like a hammer on a coffin lid, and he pointed it directly at the man.
And you! I know you! My officers put you in a holding cell yesterday for expired tags, boy! You think because you're wearing a suit today, you belong in this courtroom? Who do you think you are?
The man took one step forward, his eyes burning with a freezing calm.
My name is Desmond Hale, Judge Boone, and 41 days ago, the United States Senate confirmed me as a United States District Judge. Yesterday, you jailed the federal law itself. Today, I came to read the paper trail that is going to tear your entire machine down.
Hold that moment. Freeze it right there. The judge with his gavel in the air, and the man in the funeral suit who just told him the floor was about to disappear, because the sentence Desmond Hale just spoke was not a threat. It was a promise, and within 72 hours, the most powerful man in Carrow County, 19 years untouchable, 19 years unquestioned, would be stripped of his robe, his law license, and finally, his liberty. The machine he had built to cage the poor would come apart, bolt by bolt, in the full light of day, in that exact room. But to understand how a sitting federal judge ended up in a county holding cell, you have to go back before the funeral suit, back before the holding cell, back to a quiet old man, and a steel toolbox, and a death that set fire to an entire corrupt county. My name is Cyrus Vale. On this channel, The Paper Trail, I read the documents the powerful assume nobody will ever request, the financial disclosures, the county budgets, the contracts with the private companies, the things they file in plain sight, because they have been unquestioned for so long that they've forgotten that public record means anyone can look. Most people never look. That's the whole machine. It runs on the safe bet that you are too tired, too poor, too afraid, or too alone to ever pull the file. This story is about the day someone finally pulled the file. It happened in Carrow County, in a town called Ashgrove, in a corner of the deep south, where the highway billboards still promise progress, and the county jail is the third largest employer in town. If you drove through Ashgrove on a Sunday, you'd find it pretty. Oak trees, a water tower, a diner with good pie. What you would not see, because it is built precisely so that you cannot see it, is the machine that takes a $150 mistake and turns it into $2,400 in a cage. The machine that, year after year, balanced an entire town's budget on the backs of the people least able to carry it, and the people it took from were not chosen at random. I want to be very clear about that, because the men who ran this machine spent a great deal of energy pretending that it was random. It was not. Pull the data. And federal investigators eventually pulled all of it. And the picture is not subtle. In a town that was barely a third black residents received more than 70% of the citations. More than 80% of the bench warrants and nearly every single one of the jail sentences handed down for the simple, manufactured crime of being poor on a payment plan. That is not weather. Weather doesn't read a name in a neighborhood before it decides where to rain. The man in the funeral suit understood machines. He had spent 20 years of his life taking them apart. But the town of Ashgrove didn't know that yet. To them, he was nobody. An old truck, a dead father, a dark suit. Exactly the kind of man their machine was built to grind down without a sound. They had no idea who they had just put in the back row of that courtroom. They were about to find out. To understand what happened, you have to understand how the machine actually worked. Not the cruelty of it, the engineering of it, because cruelty alone does not survive 19 years. Engineering does. It started, as these things always start, with a budget shortfall and a bad idea, dressed up as a smart one. Years back, Ashgrove's tax base had been bleeding out. The mill closed. The young people left. The county commission stared at a hole in the budget. And a young, ambitious municipal judge named Harlan Boone offered them a solution that sounded almost responsible. Let the offenders pay for the system. Raise the fines. Add the fees. Let the people who break the rules fund the courts that enforce them. Who could argue with that? Nobody wants to raise taxes. Everybody likes the idea that the guilty pay their own way. But here is the quiet poison at the center of that idea. The moment a court stops being funded by the public and starts being funded by the fines it collects, the court is no longer in the business of justice. It is in the business of revenue. And a business needs customers, and the most reliable customers. The ones who can't afford a lawyer to make you stop. The ones who miss a payment and trigger the fees. The ones nobody important will ever come asking about. Are the poor. So the machine learned. It learned to write more tickets at the end of every fiscal quarter. When the numbers ran short, federal investigators would later find internal emails, actual emails, in which the police chief told his officers that productivity was down, and reminded them, in writing, that citations were how the department kept the lights on. They were quotas. They didn't call them quotas, because quotas are illegal. So they called them performance targets. A target is just a quota wearing a tie, and the machine learned to compound. This was the genius and the evil of it. One citation was nothing, $150, but the machine was designed so that the people most likely to be ticketed were also the people least likely to be able to pay in full, on time, the first time, and every stumble, every late payment, every missed court date, every hospital stay, triggered another fee. The fees did not punish the crime. The fees punished poverty. They turned being broke into a separate, ongoing, escalating offense. Let me show you what that looks like on one human life. Because there is a woman at the center of this story, and you have already met her. Her name is Odessa Pickett, 71 years old, a retired school cafeteria cook. Avidov, a woman who had pressed the same Sunday dress every week for 40 years, 18 months before Desmond Hale came home. A deputy pulled Odessa over for a taillight she did not even know was out. One taillight, $150 citation she could not pay that month, because that was the month her sister went into hospice 3 counties over. And a bus ticket to say goodbye costs the same whether the law thinks you can afford it or not. So, she missed the first payment, the late fee attached, then the failure to appear fee, because she'd missed a court date she never knew about, then the administrative processing fee, then the private collections surcharge, then a bench warrant fee, for a warrant they issued when she fell behind during her own stay in the hospital. $150 had become $2,400. And the arithmetic of it was not arithmetic at all. It was a trap, dressed up in the language of a courtroom. Odessa Pickett had paid that court more than $600 over 18 months. In $40 pieces, she could not really spare. And she owed more at the end of it than she had at the beginning. Because you cannot pay off a thing that is designed to grow every time you touch it. And then, the part that turns a sad story into a crime. The machine added a private partner. Its name was Meridian Court Solutions, a court services and offender management company. Meridian collected the debts. Meridian ran the supervision. And the monthly check-ins poor people had to make, each one carrying its own $25 fee, paid not to the court, but to Meridian. Meridian sent the threatening letters. Meridian, in effect, was a private debt collector that had been handed the power of the state, including the power to recommend a warrant for anyone who fell behind on their payments to Meridian, a private company, profiting on every dollar squeezed out of Odessa Pickett, on the very warrant for her arrest. I told you I read the paperwork. So hold on to that name, Meridian Court Solutions. We will come back to who owned it, and when you find out, you will understand why 19 years of this was allowed to stand. For now, just understand the shape of the thing. A town that turned its courthouse into a cash register. A police force turned into a collections arm. A private company turned into a profit engine. And underneath all of it, a population of people, disproportionately black, uniformly poor, turned into a renewable resource, harvested, quarter after quarter, year after year, and, presiding over all of it, intouchable, was Harlan Boone. There were 3 men at the top, and you should know their names, because by the end of this story, all 3 will be known to the entire country. Judge Harlan Boone, 19 years on the municipal bench. He liked to be called the most efficient judge in the state. And by his own grotesque definition, he was. He could process a docket of 40 people in under 90 minutes, which is another way of saying that he could decide 40 human lives in the time it takes to watch a movie. He never reversed himself. He was never reversed. Because municipal court rulings in a town that size are almost never appealed. Because appealing costs money. And the entire point of the machine was that its victims didn't have any. Boone wasn't cruel for the sport of it. Exactly. He was cruel. The way a furnace is hot. It was simply the nature of the thing he had built. And he had stopped being able to feel it a long time ago. Chief Garrett Pruitt. He ran the police department. And he ran it like a sales floor. He was the one who set the performance targets. He was the one whose officers knew which neighborhoods to patrol at the end of a slow month, and which stops would generate the most billable paper. Pruitt understood, better than Boone did, that the whole machine was illegal in spirit and indefensible in writing, which is exactly why he was so careful never to put the worst of it in writing, except, of course, that he did. They always do. The man could not resist sending one email too many, and then there was Lyle Tackett. You won't have heard of Lyle Tackett. That was the point of Lyle Tackett. He didn't sit on a bench or wear a badge. He owned things, quietly, through other companies, the way money likes to be owned. He had a development firm, a couple of car lots, and a court services company that did business across 4 counties under the name Meridian Court Solutions. And Lyle Tackett was Harlan Boone's brother-in-law. I want you to sit with the elegance of that, because it is the whole rotten heart of this case. The judge sentenced you. The police arrested you. And the private company that profited from collecting every dollar of your debt, the company whose fees compounded on your poverty, the company that recommended the warrant when you fell behind, was owned by the judge's own brother-in-law. Every time Boone refused to lower a fine, every time he ordered supervision, every time he turned someone over to Meridian instead of giving them a payment plan they could actually survive, he was, in the most direct and literal sense, putting money into his own family, his sister's household, his own Thanksgiving table. A judge has exactly one job: to be impartial, to have no stake in the outcome. Harlan Boone had a financial stake in the outcome of nearly every case he heard, and he had had it for years, and he had never once disclosed it, because in 19 years, no one had ever had the standing, the courage, or the firepower to make him. There had been one, years earlier. A legal aid attorney named Wendell Ackerman had filed a complaint, a careful, well-documented complaint, alleging that Ash Grove's municipal court was running an unconstitutional debt collection scheme. Within a year, Ackerman's small nonprofit lost its county contract. His office lease was not renewed. The bar received 3 anonymous complaints about his conduct, all of which evaporated under scrutiny, but each of which cost him months, and money, and sleep he did not have. He left the state. The message landed exactly as it was meant to. In Carrow County, the lesson was clear, and it was old. The law was not a thing that protected you. The law was a thing that happened to you, and the people it happened to had a color, and a zip code, and an empty wallet, and no one was ever coming to help. That was the truth of Ash Grove. On the morning Desmond Hale walked into that courthouse to settle a dead man's bill, Desmond Hale had not set foot in Ash Grove in 11 years. He told himself, on the long drive south, that it was the work. The work was real. God knew the work was real. But the truth, the one, he let himself feel only somewhere around hour 6 on the interstate, with the radio off and the fields going by, was simpler and worse. He had stayed away because coming home meant facing what this town had done to his father, and facing that meant facing his own part in it, that he had been somewhere else, doing important things. While it happened, the call had come on a Tuesday. His father, Eldridge Hale, was dead, 78 years old. His heart, the doctor said, though Desmond would come to believe, would come to know, with a certainty that had nothing to do with cardiology, that the machine had a hand in it too, that you can take enough from a proud man, a piece at a time, that his heart finally just declines to keep doing the work. Eldridge Hale had spent 40 years as a machinist in the Ash Grove rail yard. He was a quiet man, a precise man, a man who believed, really, fundamentally believed, the way some men believe in Scripture, that if you worked hard and broke no laws and paid what you owed, the country would, in the end, will deal fair with you. He had voted in every election since 1968. He had a flag on his porch, and he had a steel toolbox that he'd carried to that rail yard for 4 decades, the handle worn smooth and dark by his own hand, and taped inside the lid, in his careful block printing, a single index card that his son would not find until the worst day of his life. Desmond arrived the night before the funeral. He let himself into his father's small house off Calhoun Street, the house Eldridge had owned outright, paid off the hard way over 30 years. And he stood in the dark living room, and he could not make himself turn on the lights, because turning on the lights would make it real, that the chair was empty and would stay empty. He drove the old pickup his father had left in the carport. He wore the dark suit he had worn to too many funerals already, and when the people of Ash Grove looked at him, at the diner, at the funeral home, at the gas station, they saw exactly what their machine had trained them to see: a middle-aged black man in an old truck, work-roughened hands, a funeral suit. The kind of man you don't look at twice. The kind of man you can process in 90 seconds and bill for a decade. Not one of them saw the other thing, because Desmond Hale, the quiet man in the old pickup, had, 11 years after he last drove out of this town, been confirmed, just 6 weeks earlier, by the United States Senate, to the federal bench. He was, as of 41 days ago, the Honorable Desmond Hale, United States District Judge, and before that, for 20 years before that, he had been a trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, the Special Litigation Section, the exact office, the exact unit, the exact human beings whose entire job is to investigate and dismantle police departments and local courts that prey on the poor and the black for 20 years. Desmond Hale had taken apart machines exactly like the one running in Ash Grove. He knew their gears. He knew their language. He knew. The moment he heard a clerk say the words, administrative processing fee, precisely what he was looking at. The way a doctor knows a cough. He had not come home to use any of that. He had come home to bury his father. But the town of Ash Grove was about to make a mistake it had never made in 19 years. It was about to reach out and grind down the one man on earth who knew exactly where its teeth were. I need to tell you what Desmond found in his father's house, because it is the reason this story has the ending it has. It is the reason a federal judge, who could simply have flashed his credentials and walked away untouched, chose instead to let the machine come for him. Desmond found the papers in a kitchen drawer, the night after the funeral, looking for nothing in particular, and unable to sleep. They were arranged the way his father arranged everything, neatly, chronologically, in a manila folder, labeled in block letters, and they told a story Eldridge Hale had never once told his son, because pride is its own kind of silence. It had started, of all things, with a rolling stop. 2 years before he died, Eldridge, 76 years old, slowing down, a man who had driven that rail yard route for 40 years without a single accident, had rolled through a stop sign on an empty street at 6 in the morning. On his way to the early shift, he still worked part-time, because he was bored of being retired. Citation, $100. He had tried to pay it. He had gone to the courthouse. Eldridge Hale, who believed in the system, who wanted to pay what he owed. And there had been a problem with the date. And a window had closed. And a fee had attached. Then another. He had gone back. He had stood in lines. He had filled out forms in his careful hand. And the machine, sensing a man who could pay a little, but not all at once, did what it was built to do. It put him on a payment plan with Meridian. It added supervision. It added the monthly fee for the privilege of being supervised. And when, 1 month, his pension check came late, just 1 month, it issued a notice that suspended his driver's license. His license, a 76-year-old machinist's driver's license, suspended over a rolling stop that had ballooned to $900 in fees. And with his license suspended, his father could no longer legally drive to the rail yard job, or to the pharmacy, or to church. A man who had driven himself everywhere for 60 years was suddenly, in his own town, grounded. He had relied on neighbors. He had been ashamed. And once, Desmond found this in a letter, a copy his father had kept. Eldridge had written to the court, by hand, a letter that Desmond read standing up in that kitchen at 2 in the morning, and then had to put down because his hands were shaking too hard to hold it. I have paid taxes in this county for 51 years. His father had written, "I have never asked anyone for anything. I am asking now only to be allowed to drive to my work and my church. I do not understand how a rolling stop has become this. I am an old man. And I am trying to do this right. Please." There was no record of a reply. The garnishments had come out of his pension for the last 18 months of his life. Small amounts. Steady. The machine. Taking its piece. Quarter after quarter. From an old man's retirement. Until the heart that had carried him through 40 years in the rail yard, simply, one Tuesday morning, declined to carry him any further. Desmond sat on the kitchen floor, with his back against the cabinets, and his father's letter in his hands. Until the sun came up, he was not a man who cried easily. He did not cry then. What he did was worse, and quieter, and far more dangerous to the men who ran Ashgrove. He took the manila folder, and he set it on the kitchen table, and he squared its edges, and he thought about the thing his father used to say to him when he was a boy. When Desmond would come home raging about something unfair at school, some teacher, some rule, his father would put down whatever he was fixing, and he would look at his son, and he would say it the same way every time. The law is meant to be a shield. So, not on it. You remember that. And if you ever get the chance, you make them remember it too. The next morning, Desmond Hale put on the funeral suit one more time, and he drove to the courthouse to clear a dead man's debt. And he had no idea that the machine was already pulling into the parking lot behind him. It would be neat to say that Desmond planned what happened next. He didn't. That is the part the men who ran Ashgrove never understood. Even at the end, he did not go looking for them. The machine came and found him, because finding men like him was the only thing the machine knew how to do. He had only just stepped out of the courthouse, into the white morning heat, before he ever reached the counter to clear his father's debt. He was standing in the parking lot, by his father's old pickup, making a phone call, when the cruiser rolled up behind him. 2 officers, Marsh and Dunmore. He would learn the names later. He would learn them very well. Officer Cody Marsh was young, eager, the kind of young that has not yet been taught that a badge is a responsibility and not a license. Officer Wade Dunmore was older, heavier, with the flat, dead patience of a man who has run this play 1,000 times and knows exactly how it ends. This, your vehicle, it was my father's promise. Desmond said, "I'm clearing his estate." That's not what I asked. Desmond looked at the two of them, and he understood, with the perfect clarity of a man who had questioned 100 officers exactly like these, precisely what was happening. The truck had out-of-county plates, which his father had let lapse in his last sick months. That was the pretext. The pretext is always small. The pretext is supposed to be small. The pretext is just the doorway. The room behind it is the machine. The registration's expired. Dunmore said, walking a slow circle around the truck the way a man circles a thing he already owns. You got a license on you. Desmond had a wallet, and in that wallet, behind his regular license, was a second piece of identification, a federal judicial credential, an official card issued to him 41 days earlier, that would have ended this entire encounter in about 4 seconds. One flash of it, and Marsh and Dunmore would have gone pale and gotten very polite. Very fast. Desmond did not reach for it. I have thought a long time about why. I think part of it was grief, and the strange clarity grief gives you, where you stop being afraid of small things because you've just lost a large one. But I think most of it was the manila folder, sitting on his father's kitchen table. I think Desmond Hale stood in that parking lot and understood that if he flashed the credential, he would walk away clean, but the machine would keep running. Odessa would still be in a cell. His father's letter would still have no reply. And the next old man, and the one after that, would still be ground down. Quarter after quarter. While the Wendell Ackermans of the world got driven out of the state, a federal judge has a great deal of power. But it is power that lives in records, in evidence, in process. Desmond Hale, standing in that parking lot, made a decision that I believe his father would have understood completely. He decided not to escape the machine. He decided to let it bite down on him, so that he could finally see, from the inside, exactly where its teeth were. My regular license is current, he said evenly, and handed it over. The truck's registration lapsed while my father was dying. I'll renew it today. Step out of the vehicle. I'm not in the vehicle. Officer, don't get smart. Boy, there it was. The word dropped casually, the way they always drop it. Testing, probing, looking for the reaction that justifies the escalation. A grown man, a federal judge, addressed as boy in his dead father's parking lot. By an officer half his age, Desmond did not react. He had learned, decades ago, that they want the reaction. The reaction is the product. The reaction is what they sell to the judge as resisting, as disorderly, as combative, the upcharge, the additional billable offense. So he kept his hands visible. He kept his voice level. He answered every question with a precision that should have warned them. If either of them had been the kind of man who could be warned, but he had committed the unforgivable sin. In a machine like this one, he had been calm. He had been articulate. He had been unafraid. And in a town where the entire economy ran on frightened, compliant poverty, a black man in a parking lot who was not afraid was not a citizen. He was a malfunction, so they manufactured the rest. Dunmore claimed Desmond had moved aggressively. Marsh claimed he'd refused lawful commands. Neither was true. And both of them knew it wasn't true. And it did not matter. Because in Carrow County, the officer's word was weather too. They put a federal judge in handcuffs in his dead father's parking lot on charges of expired registration, failure to comply, and disorderly conduct. And they put him in the back of the cruiser. And they drove him to the Carrow County Jail. And the whole way there, in the back of that car, his wrists cuffed behind him, the Honorable Desmond Hale, United States District Judge, 20 years of the Civil Rights Division behind him, did not say one word. He was memorizing everything. The jail told him more in 6 hours than 6 months of subpoenas could have. They booked him at a long counter, under fluorescent lights. And Desmond watched the process the way an engineer watches a rival's assembly line. He watched the booking fee, $25, charged simply for the act of being arrested. Charged before any human being had determined whether he'd done anything at all. He watched a clerk recite the bail schedule from memory. The numbers set high enough that anyone poor would have to choose between paying a private bondsman a non-refundable fee or sitting in a cell. And he watched. In the corner, a small placard advertising the services of. There it was again. Meridian Court Solutions, your partner in offender management. And he watched the people. There was a young woman, 2 seats down on the booking bench, maybe 25. In a fast food uniform she hadn't had time to change out of. Her name was Keisha Daniels. She cleaned houses on the side and worked the drive-through. And she had 2 kids at her mother's right now. And she was crying, not loudly, just steadily, the tears running, and her not even bothering to wipe them, because her hands were cuffed. Her car had been impounded, a car she needed for both jobs. and for getting her kids to school. The impound fee was already more than the car was worth. And it climbed every day the car sat in that lot, which meant the longer she couldn't afford to get it out, the more she would owe to get it out. A perfect little engine of despair, designed so that the exit costs more than the door. They keep saying I can pay it off. She said, to no one, to Desmond, to the fluorescent lights. Every time I pay, it's more than before. How do you pay off a thing that gets bigger every time you pay it? Desmond looked at her for a long moment. You don't, he said quietly. It's not built to be paid off. It's built to be carried. That's the difference. And it's not your fault that nobody ever told you the difference. She stared at him. Something in how he'd said it. Not pity, not the worn-out comfort of someone equally trapped, but something steadier. Something that sounded almost like knowledge. Who are you? She asked. Desmond almost smiled. It was the first time anyone in Ash Grove had thought to ask. Just a man who came home to bury his father. He said, same as you. I expect. Just trying to do this right. They put him in a holding cell that smelled of bleach and old fear. And through the bars, he saw the rest of the inventory of the machine. A boy who could not have been older than 16. Tire Booker. Desmond would learn. Funneled into the adult system off a citation that had started, unbelievably, at his high school. A disorderly conduct ticket. For talking back to a school resource officer, which had become a court date, which had become a failure to appear, because his mother worked days and couldn't take him, which had become a warrant for a child, 16 years old, in a county holding cell, learning the lesson the machine taught everyone eventually, that the law was not a shield, that the law was a net, and he had been born inside it. And the only question anyone here was ever asked was how much they could be made to pay on the way down, and down the row. In the women's holding, Desmond could hear a voice, not crying, praying, quietly, steadily, the words worn smooth by a lifetime of use. It was Odessa Pickett. They had picked her up 2 days earlier on the bench warrant, and she was waiting, in that cell, for her hearing in the morning. And Desmond Hale sat on the steel bench, and he listened to a 71-year-old woman pray. Lord, I know you see me. Lord, I know you see all of this. Lord, send somebody. You've been sending somebody since the beginning of time. Send somebody now. Desmond stood up. He walked to the bars, and he asked the guard, politely, the way he had asked every question all day, for his one phone call in the machine the men of Ash Grove had run for 19 years. The phone call was a joke. It was a call to a bondsman, or to a relative who couldn't help, or to a public defender, so overworked he couldn't return it for days. The phone call was just one more place where the trap discovered the depth of the trap. Desmond Hale's phone call was different. He did not call a bondsman. He did not call a relative. He dialed a number he knew by heart. A direct line in a building in Washington. And when a voice answered, a sharp, familiar voice, a voice that had been a young attorney under his wing a dozen years ago, and was now one of the most formidable civil rights lawyers in the country. He said 5 words that would end the machine. Renata. It's Desmond. Listen. Renata Vaughn was the section chief of the Special Litigation Section, of the Civil Rights Division, of the United States Department of Justice. She was the person, in the entire federal government, most directly responsible for investigating and dismantling local courts and police departments that prey on the poor under color of law. She had learned the work 12 years earlier from a relentless senior attorney named Desmond Hale, who had taught her the single most important thing she knew: that these machines never died from outrage. They died from records. And here is the thing that turned this from a tragedy into a reckoning. The Special Litigation Section had already opened a file on Carrow County 8 months earlier. The pattern in the data had been too clean to ignore. The citation numbers, the racial disparities, the bench warrants per person, the strange and persistent presence of a private company called Meridian in 4 counties worth of municipal courts. They had a cooperating witness on the inside. They had subpoenas pending. They had been building the case slowly, carefully, the way you build a case that has to hold up against men who own the local judge. What they had been missing was the one thing that breaks a case like this open: a victim whose word could not be dismissed, because that was the machine's final defense, that its victims were poor and black and could always be made to look like people who simply hadn't followed the rules. The system had been built to make them unbelievable, and now the machine, in its perfect blindness, had reached out and arrested a sitting United States district judge on a manufactured charge with a slur and thrown him in a cell. "Say that again," Renata Vaughn said, very slowly. On the other end of the line, they arrested me, Desmond said. "Expired tags. On my late father's truck. The arresting officer called me boy. They invented a failure to comply and a disorderly. I'm in the Carrow County jail right now. The booking fee is already on my account. And Renata, I've been watching the intake for 6 hours. It's worse than the data. There's a 71-year-old woman, 3 cells down, picked up on a bench warrant over a taillight, waiting for a hearing in the morning. There's a 16-year-old in the adult holding off a school ticket. Meridian's name is on a placard on the booking wall. The judge's name is Boone. The chief is Pruitt. A pause. I'm not calling you as a judge. I know what I can and can't do from the bench. I'm calling you as a witness, the best one you are ever going to get." There was a silence on the line. Then Renata Vaughn said the words that would change Carrow County forever. "Don't say another word to anyone. Don't sign anything. We've had this file open for 8 months. Desmond, we have the data. We have a cooperating clerk. We've been waiting for exactly this." Her voice was iron. "I'm putting a team in the air tonight." Desmond hung up the phone. He walked back to the steel bench. And down the row, Odessa Pickett was still praying, "Lord, send somebody." And Desmond Hale, who had just summoned the full weight of the United States Department of Justice down on the town that had jailed his father, closed his eyes and let her finish. Somebody was coming. Here's what most people get wrong about justice. They think it arrives like a thunderclap. They think it's the moment, the reveal, the gasp, the villain's face going white. And there is a moment like that coming in this story. And it is everything you want it to be. But the moment is never what wins. The paper wins. The moment is just when the paper finally gets read out loud. While Desmond Hale sat in a holding cell, the machine he had summoned began to move. And it moved on documents. And the foundation of all of it was a woman named Simone Adair. Simone was 28 years old. She was a clerk in the Carrow County Municipal Court, Boone's own courtroom. She was black. She had grown up 3 streets over from Odessa Pickett. And for 2 years, she had sat at her little desk, to the side of Harlan Boone's bench, and watched the machine grind, day after day, with a sick feeling in her stomach that she could not name out loud, because naming it would cost her the only good job she'd ever had. And then, one afternoon, she had watched Boone sentence a young mother to 10 days for falling behind on Meridian's supervision fees, And the young mother had asked, very quietly, "Who is going to get my daughter from daycare?" And Boone had not even looked up. And something in Simone Adair had broken clean through. She did not quit. That is the part that takes real courage. She stayed. And she began. Quietly. Carefully. Terrified every single day. To keep copies. Of the dockets. Of the fee schedules. Of the emails that crossed her desk. Including the ones from Chief Pruitt. About performance targets. And keeping the lights on. Of the Meridian invoices, which a curious person could cross-reference against the court's own records. To see, in black and white, exactly how much money flowed from the poorest people in the county into a private company. Every single month. And one day, 8 months before Desmond Hale came home, Simone Adair had done the bravest thing a person in her position can do. She had found the number for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, and she had called it, and she had said, "I work inside it. I can show you how it works. I just need someone with enough power that they can't make me disappear. The way they made the last one disappear." So when Renata Vaughn's team landed that night, they did not land empty-handed and outraged. They landed with 8 months of Simone Adair's documents, with federal subpoena power, and with the testimony of a sitting federal judge who had just been arrested inside the machine he had spent his career taking apart, and they went straight for the one thing that turns a sad pattern into a federal crime. The money. They went for Meridian. Federal subpoenas have a way of making private companies cough up their ownership records. And when Meridian Court Solutions finally coughed up its ownership records, peeling back the shell company that held it, and the shell company that held that, the name at the bottom was Lyle Tackett. And it took the investigators about an hour to establish what every cousin in Ashgrove already knew at family reunions, that Lyle Tackett was married to Harlan Boone's sister, that the judge and the owner of the collections company sat at the same Thanksgiving table, that for years, every dollar Boone's rulings funneled into Meridian had flowed, in the end, into his own family's accounts. There was a federal statute, Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. It makes it a federal crime for someone acting with the authority of the state, a judge, a police officer, to willfully deprive a person of the rights guaranteed by the Constitution. And when a judge with an undisclosed financial interest jails people who cannot pay debts that flow to his own family, when he does it knowingly, year after year, for profit, that is not a gray area. That is the textbook. That is the photograph in the dictionary. Next to the words, "Bedam," the federal team had what they needed. They knew about the quotas, and the kickbacks, and the brother-in-law, and the suspended licenses, and the garnished pensions. They had a sitting federal judge as a victim and a witness, and they had a courageous clerk as a cooperating insider, with 8 months of documents that told the whole filthy story, in the machine's own words. And they knew that Harlan Boone, with the perfect arrogance of a man who had never once been questioned, had a full municipal docket scheduled for that very morning. 40 more people, 40 more lives, to be decided in 90 minutes. Bile. And warranted. And supervised. And caged. The first case on that docket was a hearing for a 71-year-old woman, picked up on a bench warrant, over a tail light. Renata Vaughn made one decision that morning that tells you everything about why some prosecutors are remembered, and most are not. She could have arrested Boone at his home, quietly, in his bathrobe. Instead, she chose to let him take the bench one final time. She got Desmond released overnight, quietly, on his own recognizance, so as not to tip the operation. And she asked him to do one thing: to sit in the back row of that courtroom in the morning, to be there as a witness when the machine ran, one last time, in the full light of day, with federal agents seated in the gallery, and a court reporter capturing every word, because some things have to be undone in the exact place where they were done. Some reckonings have to happen in the room, and that brings us back to where this story began. The morning docket in Carrow County Municipal Court began like 19 years of mornings before it. Harlan Boone took the bench at 9. He did not notice the 3 unfamiliar men and women in dark suits, seated quietly in the gallery. He did not notice that the court reporter was new, or that she was recording with unusual care. He did not notice that the broad-shouldered man in the funeral suit was back in the last row, sitting with the stillness of a man who has all the time in the world. Boone noticed none of it, because noticing was not a thing the machine required of him. The machine required only that he process. The first case was called Odessa Piquet. They brought her in from the holding cells in her pressed Sunday dress, her church hat held in both hands against her chest, like a small shield. She had paid that court $600. She could not spare, and she owed more now than when she'd started. And she stood in front of Harlan Boone and said, in a voice that did not shake, because women like Odessa Pickett have learned not to give people the satisfaction, I can pay $40 a month. Your Honor, I've been paying $40 a month. I got the receipts right here. And Harlan Boone, not looking up, he said the words you heard at the very beginning of this story. The words that were the last thing he would ever say from that bench as a free man. $200. Or 30 days. The court is not a charity. He nodded to the bailiff. And in the back row, a broad-shouldered black man in a dark funeral suit stood up slowly. You know what Boone said next? He pointed his gavel like a weapon, latching onto the easiest target in the room. The troublemaker with the expired tags. The nobody in the borrowed-looking suit. And you. I know you. My officers put you in a holding cell yesterday for expired tags. Boy, you think because you're wearing a suit today, you belong in this courtroom. Who do you think you are? And now you know everything that the man in the back row was carrying when he answered. The father in the fresh grave. The letter with no reply. The pension, garnished to the end. The woman praying in the cell. The 8 months of documents. The full weight of the United States. Waiting in the gallery, Desmond Hale took one step forward, his eyes burning with a freezing calm. My name is Desmond Hale, Judge Boone, and 41 days ago, the United States Senate confirmed me as a United States District Judge. He reached into his jacket, and he took out the federal credential he had refused to show in the parking lot, the one that would have set him free. And he held it open, so the whole room could see it. You had a United States District Judge in your jail yesterday. You let your officer call me boy. You charged me a booking fee for the privilege. He turned, slowly, and looked at the gallery, at the ordinary, frightened, exhausted faces of Ashgrove, the people who came every morning to watch their neighbors fed into the machine. And the only reason I let you do it, the only reason I didn't show this card in that parking lot and walk away clean, is because if I had, you would have ground up the next 40 people on today's docket, exactly the way you were about to grind up this woman. For a taillight, exactly the way you ground up a 76-year-old machinist named Eldridge Hale, until his license was gone, and his pension was garnished, and his heart finally gave out. His voice did not break, but everyone in that room heard the thing underneath it. That was my father. Judge Boone, you billed a dead man. That is why I came to your courtroom, to clear a dead man's debt. And instead I found out what you have been doing to this whole town. Harlan Boone's gavel hand had come to rest on the bench. He was not banging it anymore. The color was gone from his face entirely now. The men and women in the gallery, the federal agents, had risen quietly to their feet. One of them stepped forward. "My name is Renata Vaughn. I am the section chief of the Special Litigation Section, Civil Rights Division, United States Department of Justice." Her voice filled the small room without rising. "As of 6 o'clock this morning, this court and the Ash Grove Police Department are the subjects of a federal investigation under Title 18, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. I have agents in this room. Chief Garrett Pruitt was taken into custody 20 minutes ago. And you, Judge Boone, are not going to impose one more sentence in this courtroom. Not today. Not ever. For one long, frozen second." Harlan Boone simply did not compute it. The words did not fit inside the world he had built. In 19 years, no one had ever said stop to him. The concept was not available, but Desmond was not finished. Because the reveal of who he was, devastating as it was not the blow that ended Harlan Boone. The reveal was just the moment the room finally went quiet enough to hear the paper read out loud. The blow was the question. Desmond took one more step toward the bench. "You've spent 19 years up there. Judge Boone, telling people this court isn't a charity. You said it 30 seconds ago. To this woman, the court is not a charity. And you're right. It isn't. So I have one question for you. For the record, in front of all these people whose lives you have been deciding for 19 years, the court reporter's hands were poised. Renata Vaughn did not move. The whole room was a held breath. When you sentenced Odessa Pickett, just now, when you refused her a payment plan, she could survive. Can you tell this courtroom how much of her $2,400 was flowing to a company called Meridian Court Solutions? Boone's jaw worked. Nothing came out. And can you tell this courtroom who owns Meridian Court Solutions? Silence. Because we have the ownership records now. The federal subpoenas came back this morning. So let me ask you plainly, and let me ask you the way you've asked 10,000 frightened people in this room. Yes. Or no? He paused. Is it true that Meridian Court Solutions, the company that profited from every fee you imposed, the company you turned the poorest people in this county over to, the company whose collections you enforced from that bench, is owned by your own brother-in-law, Lyle Tackett? The question hit the courtroom like a physical thing. You could see it move through the gallery. The slow, dawning, terrible comprehension. The understanding of what they had all been living inside. It was never weather. It was never bad luck. It was never their fault for not following the rules well enough. It was a family business. The judge sentenced you, and the judge's brother-in-law collected, and the judge's family got rich. And that was the whole entire reason. The fines never went down, and the payment plans never worked, and the warrants always came. They had been the harvest, and the man in the robe, the most powerful man any of them had ever stood in front of, had been stealing from them with one hand while he caged them with the other. Harlan Boone opened his mouth. He was a man who had talked his way out of everything for 19 years. And for the first time, there were no words, because there was no version of the truth that did not end him. And there were federal agents standing in his gallery, and a court reporter was taking down every second of his silence. And in his eyes, finally, was the thing that had been missing for 19 years. Not remorse. It was too late, and too small for remorse. It was fear, the pure, undisguised fear of a man who has just felt. For the very first time, the floor he thought was bedrock turned to water under his feet. Judge Harlan Boone. Renata Vaughn said, "Step down from that bench. Now," and the most feared man in Carrow County. 19 years untouchable. 19 years unquestioned. The man whose word had been weather stood up on legs that did not want to hold him and stepped down from the bench he had ruled like a god, and did not gavel another human being for the rest of his life. The room did not erupt. Not yet. It was too stunned, too full. The air too thick with 19 years of swallowed grief. Suddenly finding the exit, it was the silence of something enormous breaking, the silence of a town hearing. For the first time, the sound of its own chains coming off, and in the front of the courtroom, a bailiff, uncertain now, looked at the handcuffs in his hand, and then looked at Odessa Pickett, and he did not put them on her. Somebody walked her to a chair. Somebody brought her a cup of water, and a 71-year-old woman who had asked God to send somebody sat down and put a trembling hand over her mouth and began, very quietly, to weep. After that, it came fast, the way these things always come. Once the first beam goes, slow for 19 years, and then all at once, Chief Garrett Pruitt was charged that day. The performance target emails, the ones he could not resist writing, the ones that said in his own words that citations were how the department kept the lights on, became the centerpiece of the case against him. A man who had run a police department like a sales floor discovered that the receipts he'd been so proud of were now Exhibit A. 2 of his officers were charged alongside him, including a young man named Cody Marsh and an older one named Wade Dunmore, who had cuffed a federal judge in a parking lot and called him boy, and whose own dashboard camera footage, which they had never imagined anyone with power would ever request, captured every second of it. Lyle Tackett, who had spent his whole life being invisible on purpose. I found his name on the front of every newspaper in the state. Meridian Court Solutions was shut down. Its operations in all 4 counties were frozen and placed under investigation. The shell companies were peeled apart. On Ebewan. And the money, years of it, harvested from the poorest people in the region, was traced, and a great deal of it was eventually clawed back. And Harlan Boone, 19 years, the most efficient judge in the state. He surrendered his judicial office within the week. Then he surrendered his license to practice law. And then he surrendered, in the end, his liberty. The federal case against him took time. These cases always take time. That is how you make them stick. But it did not fail. The pattern was too clear. The conflict too direct. The documents too damning. And the witnesses, this time, too credible to be waved away. Because this time, the machine had made the one mistake it had never made in 19 years. It had bitten down on a man it could not make disappear. But here is what I most need you to understand. And it is the most important thing in this entire story. So I am going to slow down and say it plainly. The arrests were not the victory. Arresting 3 corrupt men is not justice. It is the beginning of justice. If all that had happened in Carrow County was that 3 men went to prison and a new judge took the bench, and the machine kept running with new operators, then nothing real would have changed. The faces would change. The harvest would continue. That is the trap of every story like this one. We are taught to be satisfied by the punishment of the villain, but the villain is never the disease. The villain is just the symptom that the disease finally let you see. The disease was the machine, and the machine, in Carrow County, did not survive that morning. That is the real story. Not that 3 men fell, but that the thing they had built fell with them. and was not allowed to be rebuilt. The Department of Justice did not pack up and go home after the arrests. That is the difference between revenge and reform. And it is the entire reason that what happened in Carrow County mattered beyond Carrow County. What Renata Vaughn's division pursued, what Desmond Hale had spent 20 years of his life pursuing, in town after town, was something with far less drama and far more power than any arrest. It was a consent decree, a binding, federal court-enforced agreement that does not punish the past so much as it forecloses the future. And the agreement that came out of Carrow County was a thing of cold, beautiful, structural justice. It abolished the fee structure entirely. No more booking fees. No more administrative processing fees. No more compounding surcharges on poverty. A fine, going forward, would be a fine, assessed against the actual offense, scaled to what a person could actually pay, and never, ever allowed to grow into a debt that swelled every time someone touched it. It severed the court from the cash register. The municipal court's budget would no longer depend, by a single dollar, on the fines it collected, the poison at the center of the whole machine. The incentive to harvest was cut out by the root. A court that does not profit from your conviction has no reason to manufacture one. It banned the private collections model. No more Meridian. No more private companies wielding the power of the state to squeeze fees out of the desperate. The supervision rackets were dismantled across all 4 counties. It installed a federal monitor, an independent official, answerable to the federal court, who would sit inside Carrow County's justice system for years and make sure the machine did not quietly reassemble itself once the cameras left. Because the cameras always leave. The monitor doesn't, and it required something the machine had spent 19 years avoiding. It required the county to look at the data, every stop, every citation, every charge, tracked by race, reported publicly, audited regularly, because you cannot fix what you refuse to count. The machine had survived by making sure no one ever added it up. The decree made the adding up mandatory, permanent, and impossible to hide. And then there was the part that made grown people weep in that gallery. The decree required restitution, the fines and the fees that had been unlawfully extracted, years of them. Dollars taken from people like Odessa Pickett and Keisha Daniels and the family of Eldridge Hale were to be identified and, wherever possible, returned. The garnishment stopped. The suspended licenses were reinstated, and every outstanding warrant tied to nothing but unpaid fees. Thousands of them, the whole inventory of the machine, was reviewed, and the unconstitutional ones were dismissed, which meant the cells emptied. Odessa Pickett's debt, the $2,400 conjured out of a taillight, was voided. Gone, as if the machine had never touched her. She would later sit in the front row of a community meeting and say, to a room full of her neighbors, the simplest and truest thing anyone said in this whole affair. I asked the Lord to send somebody. I want y'all to know. He did. Keisha Daniels got her car back. The impound fees, the engine of despair that had been designed to cost more than the exit, were waived. She kept both jobs. She got her kids to school in the mornings, in her own car, on her own time, like a free woman in a free country, which is a thing that should not be remarkable. And in Ash Grove, for the first time in 19 years, finally was, and the boy, Tyree Booker, 16 years old, funneled into an adult cell off a school ticket, had his record wiped clean. There would be no permanent mark, no shadow on his future. No early enrollment in the lesson the machine taught every black child in that county about what the law was for. He would graduate 2 years later. He would, in fact, give a speech. But that is a story for another day. There is one more thing Desmond Hale did before he left, and it is the thing that turned this from a story about an ending into a story about a beginning. The week it was over, before he drove back north, Desmond Hale went to the cemetery on the south side of Ash Grove, where the oak trees are oldest, and the graves go back further than the courthouse. And he stood in front of a stone that still smelled of fresh-cut letters. Eldridge Hale, and the dates, and below them, the words Desmond had chosen, that the men who ran Ash Grove would never understand, and that everyone in that town who had ever been ground down by the machine would understand completely. He believed it should be fair. He had brought the toolbox, his father's steel toolbox, the handle worn dark and smooth by 40 years of one man's hand. He set it down on the grass beside the grave, and he opened the lid, and he looked one more time at the index card taped inside, the careful block printing, the words his father had put there, in a hand that believed, even after everything, even after the rolling stop, and the fees, and the license, and the garnished pension, even after the country had failed to deal fair with him. The law is meant to be a shield. Som, not on it. I made them remember it. Dad, Desmond said, quietly, to the stone, to the toolbox, to the man who had spent 40 years carrying it to a rail yard, and a lifetime carrying a faith the world had done its best to break. It took me too long to come home. I'm sorry it took your name on a docket to get me here. But I made them remember. He stood there a long time, and then he did the thing his father would have been proudest of. Prouder than the Senate confirmation. Prouder than the federal bench. Prouder than any title. He did not get in the truck and drive back to his important life and let Ash Grove fade in the mirror. He stayed in the fight. Before he left, Desmond Hale established a legal aid clinic in Ash Grove. A real one. Funded. Permanent. The kind of place a man like Wendell Ackerman could have worked without being driven out of the state. A place where the next Odessa, the next Keisha, the next Tyree, we could walk in off the street and find someone who knew the gears of the machine and was not afraid of the men who ran it. He put it 3 streets over from where his father had lived, and he named it, against the wishes of his own modesty, for the man whose pension the machine had garnished, and whose faith it had failed, and whose toolbox now sat empty in the carport of a paid-off house on Calhoun Street, the Eldridge Hale Center for Justice, so that the name the machine had reduced to a line item on a dead man's bill would instead, for as long as that town stood, I mean the exact opposite of everything the machine had stood for, so that a man who had believed the law should be a shield would have his name. Finally, on a shield, I need to tell you something before we go. When I was 9 years old, my mother spent a weekend in a county jail, not for anything you would recognize as a crime. For a fine, a traffic fine she couldn't pay all at once. That turned into a bigger fine. That turned into a court date she couldn't make because she was working a double. That turned into a warrant. I remember the weekend. I remember staying at my aunt's. I remember that nobody would tell me where my mother was, and I remember the look on her face when she came home Monday. A look I did not have a word for then, and have spent my whole adult life finding the word for now. The word is humiliation. The specific, engineered humiliation of being told by the full machinery of a government you pay taxes to that your poverty is a crime, and your dignity is a thing they can take. For the price of a fine, I never forgot it. I read the paperwork on this channel. Because nobody ever read the paperwork for her. Because the machine that ran in Ashgrove runs today in 1,000 towns whose names you will never hear. Harvesting the people least able to fight back. Balancing budgets on the backs of folks whose only crime is being poor. In a country that treats poverty like a moral failing and a revenue stream at the same time, Desmond Hale got to be the hero of this story because of a series of accidents, because his father died, and his name was still on a docket, because he happened to have spent 20 years learning to take these machines apart, because he happened to have the one thing the machine could not make disappear, a federal credential in his pocket, and the will to leave it there until the moment it would do the most good. But here is the thing I most need you to hear. There is an Odessa Pickett in your county. There is a Keisha Daniels, working 2 jobs, and watching an impound fee grow faster than she can pay it. There is a Tyree Booker, 16 years old, learning right now that the law is a net, and that he was born inside it. And there is, somewhere, Simonedeo, a person sitting inside the machine, watching it grind, sick with a thing they cannot name, who needs only to know that if they pick up the phone, somebody with enough power will answer, and they will not be made to disappear. The machine runs on the safe bet that you are too tired, too poor, too afraid, or too alone to ever pull the file. So pull the file. Look up your town's municipal court revenue. Look up who it contracts with. Look up the fee schedule. Look up whether the people being ticketed look like the people doing the ticketing. It costs you nothing but an afternoon. And it is the single most dangerous thing you can do to a machine like this one, because the machine's entire existence depends on the certainty that nobody ever will. And look at the people around you. Really look. Past the old truck, past the funeral suit, past the fast food uniform, and the church hat, and the work-roughened hands. You have no idea who is standing next to you in line at the courthouse. You have no idea what they are carrying. And you have no idea what they are capable of, because this whole country is full of Eldridge Hales, and Desmond Hales, and Odessa Picketts. Extraordinary, unbreakable people whose worth gets calculated by a machine at the price of a taillight. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it pushes this story in front of someone who needs to hear today that the law is supposed to be a shield. Share it. Send it to someone who has been ground down by a fine, a fee, a warrant they never should have gotten. Send it to someone who has been looked at the way Harlan Boone looked at Odessa Pickett and decided to stand up anyway. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we are reading another file. The powerful prayed nobody would ever request. And drop me a comment below. I read every single one. Has a small fine ever turned into something that nearly swallowed you? Have you ever stood in a room where the most powerful person treated you like you were nothing? And what did you do? And tell me, honestly, in the America you actually live in, is the law a shield, or is it still a net? I'm Cyrus Vale. Pull the file.